This is the PowerPoint for Chapter 9 of our textbook, Victimization at the Beginning and the End of Life, Child and Elder Maltreatment. So first we're going to talk about child maltreatment, and we're going to talk a little bit about its history. So the first laws didn't come into effect until 1875. So before this, it was basically something that, was dealt with within families. Parents sort of had free range to raise their kids how they want, and no one really interfered with that. So one of the sort of main events that caused a change to this is the case of 9-year-old Mary Ellen. So Mary Ellen's neighbors noticed that Mary Ellen was being neglected, and they wanted to sort of figure out what to do about it. They found out that there was really no place to go to report a child that was being neglected, so instead they went to the founder of the SPCA. So, there was rules and laws against animal abuse, but not child abuse. So when that happened, the SPCA was able to intervene on behalf of Mary Ellen and get her removed from the home. So after this whole case, it kind of came to light that, we also need somewhere that is going to help children that are being abused and neglected. So the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was developed after the SPCA case. So at this time, houses of refuge existed for delinquent kids. So if parents were no longer able to have the kids in the home, they were sent to these sort of houses of refuge. And maltreated kids were also sent there, which was not a good thing because these houses of refuge also housed a lot of adult criminals and mentally ill individuals. So, it's not a good idea to put these maltreated kids with, these hardened adult criminals. So this was really not a good place for them at all. So the first juvenile court was implemented in Cook County, Illinois, and this court got jurisdiction of neglected children under the age of 16. So before that, no one really had jurisdiction of them. They were just kind of sent to these houses with delinquent kids and adult criminals. But this juvenile court said that the neglected children the court got to decide what happened to these neglected children. So the whole idea of parens patriae is something that came about at this stage, and this was thought of the state as a parent. So if the parent was no longer able to sort of deal with their child on their own, the state would intervene and sort of decide what was best for the child. Okay, so around the 1940s and 1950s, this was sort of the second wave of attention to child maltreatment issues. So the medical community really sort of put this forward and noticed when, we started taking x-rays of children that a lot of these x-rays and the injuries that they saw were consistent with child abuse. And then in the 1960s, again, the American Medical Association really started to look at this a little bit more. They started doing a lot of studies to notice sort of the effects of child abuse and maltreatment. And now they sort of declared child abuse and neglect was a public health concern. So it was no longer something that parents dealt with in their houses behind closed doors by themselves. It was a public health concern, and it was now seen, as a crime to abuse or neglect your child. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what maltreatment actually is. So the definition is any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. So there's two major forms, and the first is abuse, and this is something that is done to a child. So this could be physical abuse, which is, hitting, punching, kicking, somehow injuring your child. Emotional abuse, so putting them down, telling them, you don't love them, or psychologically abusing your child, or sexual abuse. The other major form is neglect. So this is something that is not done to a child that should be done. So basically how to, properly take care of your child. If the basic needs of a child are not met, this includes physical needs such as, a house, shelter, clothing, emotional needs, medical attention, and education, then this child is considered neglected. So abuse and neglect follow sort of under this main umbrella term of child maltreatment. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that child abuse and neglect is measured. We know that the NCVS does not take accounts from people under the age of 12, so this is not a good way of measuring child abuse and neglect. CPS reports is one way that this is done. So all 50 states voluntarily submit the CPS reports of their states. It started in 1990. In 2020, about 3 million referrals involving 7.1 million children were total for the United States. So these referrals are either screened in, so these are reports that are then investigated, or screened out. So they're diverted from CPS. So maybe someone makes a report to CPS and they think, okay, well, this is better dealt with another agency, and they, screen them out and get the other agency involved. So only about 17% of those reports were substantiated. So a lot of the time there's either not enough evidence, people are not cooperating, they're just otherwise not able to substantiate the reports. Doesn't mean it 100% did not happen, they just weren't able to prove that it did happen. So child abuse neglect, so child maltreatment is very, very hard to detect. And we really have no idea what the full extent of child maltreatment is. So neglect accounts for the vast majority of these cases. So NCANS 2020, this is CPS reports. About 76% of those were reports of neglect. So very, very high, over 3/4 of these reports were reports of neglect. 16.5 were of physical abuse, 9.4 were of sex abuse, 0.2 of sex trafficking, and 6% of other. So it's very hard to know. Sometimes, kids don't know that they're being abused or neglected. They just think it's normal. They're often not the ones that are reporting. And during COVID, we had some extra difficulties, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so the CDC also keeps track of child maltreatment, and they found that 1 in 7 children are maltreated. The National Incidence Study, again, is another study that's put on by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. However, it's not, very recent. It's only been collected 4 times since 1979, most recently 2006. I'm assuming funding is, one of the reasons. These studies are very, very expensive to put on. And these include kids investigated by CPS and cases identified elsewhere. So it, casts a little bit broader net than these CPS reports, and they get cases from elsewhere. And it's a nationally representative design. Again, these are super, super expensive to, put on. So I'm assuming that lack of funding is the reason that this has not been collected more recently. So they found that 1 in 25 children were found to be maltreated. They may have had a little bit more conservative estimate of what exactly child maltreatment was, because they did find a smaller proportion of children were maltreated than the CDC study. Okay, so who reports? So children are very unlikely to report child abuse themselves, especially younger children that don't know, what's going on or don't know how to report. There's a very, very large dark figure of child maltreatment. So parents and other relatives are often the perpetrators. So parents are not likely to report at all. They may report if they find that their child's being abused, say in a daycare or a school, but they're not very likely to report as well. So the ones that are most likely to report are professionals. So these include police officers, they include doctors, they include daycare workers, and the most common reporter is teachers. So teachers are very, very likely to report child abuse. Okay, so reported child abuse dropped drastically between 2019 and 2020. So we kind of want to, figure out why that is. Was there actually less child abuse? Very, very unlikely. In fact, I would say that there probably was more child abuse because the kids were in the home, people were stressed out. When everyone's in close quarters, I would say that child maltreatment probably increased during the COVID lockdown. However, less child abuse came to the attention of CPS. So this is due in part to schools being closed. We know that educators are most likely to report child maltreatment, and if the educators are not seeing these kids, then they're just not getting reported. So additionally, some states didn't do in-person visits during the lockdown. So if someone had a report of a child being abused, maybe they would call the parents and talk to them, but they weren't actually able to go to the house and report them. Okay, so young kids, so babies are much more likely to be abused than any other age. Birth to age 1 has a very, very high risk of maltreatment. And over 70% of children who die from maltreatment are under the age of 3. So male and female children have similar victimization risks, but it does depend on the type of victimization as well. So females were about 8.9 per 1,000 and males were about 7.9 per 1,000. Female children are much more likely to be risk at sexual abuse though. So white children are most likely to be reported, but African American and Hispanic children are disproportionately overrepresented. American Indian and Alaskan Native children have the highest victimization risk, so their risk is 15.5 per 1,000. So risk factors for child maltreatment, just being smaller and weaker than adults make them targets. Fussy children who are hard to calm down, who are crying a lot, have higher victimization risk. They are more stressful for their parents. Those who are in poverty, again, are much more likely to be victimized. Again, stressed out parents are stressed out about money. They're to take it out on their kids. And the poverty and race interaction is something that is important to talk about as well. So those that are in poverty and the interaction with a minority race is very important for explaining child abuse. So if you're white and have a low SES, you're actually less at risk than if you're black and low SES to be at risk for child abuse. Okay, so in 2020, 1,750 kids in the US died from maltreatment, so abuse and neglect. So you'll see here that those younger than the age of 1 have a very, very, very heightened risk. So it looks like maybe almost 4 times the risk of older kids. So 68% were under the age of 3, and almost 1/2 were under the age of 1 year old. So the rate of African American child fatalities from maltreatment is 3 times higher than those of whites. 80% of these fatalities were perpetrated by parents. Okay, so biological parents are very, very, very overwhelmingly most likely to maltreat their kids, 90.6% according to CPS reports. And the mothers are usually more likely than the fathers to perpetrate child abuse. Could be that the mothers are also more likely to be the parent with sole custody. So other relatives, which are siblings, uncles, aunts, grandparents, etc., make up the second largest group. And unmarried partners of parents, so boyfriends and girlfriends of parents, make up the third largest group. So there's some caretaker risk factors that make it more likely that someone will commit an act of child abuse. So those are drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence between the two parents, financial problems, inadequate housing, public assistance, caregiver disability, and depression. So the age of 18 to 44 is the largest age range for perpetrators of child abuse. This makes sense that this is the age group that's most likely to have young children at home. And the highest rates are for single-parent households living with a cohabitating partner, so more likely than married couples to perpetrate child abuse. Those with large family sizes, more at risk. Again, large families are more stressful, put stress on the parents, and they might not be able to cope and take it out on their kids. And boyfriends of the mother are common perpetrators in child abuse. So there are many consequences of child maltreatment that can last up until adulthood. These include physical, cognitive, and developmental effects. So shaken baby syndrome, this is a physical effect caused by child abuse of a very young child. It causes brain hemorrhages, skull fractures, and impacts the development of a child. It's responsible for about 12 to 1,400 deaths per year. And it's important to note that abuse and neglect can stunt growth and stunt development of both the child physically and the child's brain as well. So this can affect cognition, language, and academic abilities when the child is older. And neglected children, they might not receive proper nutrition. So they don't receive the sort of vitamins and minerals needed to, properly develop the brain. If they're not fed properly, they're going to, have physical problems, stunt their growth, etc. So being maltreated in early childhood is, the consequences are probably going to last up until adulthood. So also lots of psychological effects of maltreatment. And this might vary depending on, type of maltreatment. So it could be guilt, shame, or anger. Kids could blame themselves for breaking up the family if one of, the parents is abusive, the other one is not, and, they break up. Anxiety, depression, PTSD are also very common. For sexual violence, you'll see here in this little graph, drug abuse is a common outcome for those who have been victim of sexual violence to try and cope with the negative feelings that result from that. And it also might make unhealthy relationships. So those that are abused in childhood, might act violently towards their own romantic partners in the future because that's what they learned as a child. They also, might continue the cycle of violence, and they may then abuse their children when they have children of their own. So other consequences, delinquency. So kids that are maltreated are more likely than kids that aren't maltreated to be involved in delinquency when they get older. Doesn't mean that every maltreated kid is going to end up as a delinquent, but when you take delinquent kids, a lot of them have been maltreated in childhood. And this includes alcohol and substance abuse as well. Eating disorders to cope with these feelings of depression and anxiety that result from maltreatment. And early sexual interactions. This is especially common for those that experience sexual abuse during childhood. They're more likely to have early sexual interactions when they become teenagers. They're more likely to experience poverty and unemployment and have problems in school, also more likely to experience a teen pregnancy. So lots and lots of negative consequences from being maltreated as a child that lasts, into the teenage years and then into adulthood. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the responses to child maltreatment. So there has been, thankfully, some legislation that has been passed. 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. This defined child abuse and neglect. Before, the definition was a little, everyone kind of defined it in their own sort of way. And this made like a standardized definition that can then be used in court. It also has mandatory reporting laws. So those that are in a professional position, so those that work in schools, those that work at daycares, and those that work in doctors' offices are required to report any sort of child maltreatment that they come out with, that they are aware of. If they do not report, they can get in trouble with that. And National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Research Opportunities. So this made a lot of research funding available in order to research child abuse. Safe haven laws were also something that came out of this. So these are areas that you can leave an infant if you feel that you can't take care of it. So often this is police departments, emergency rooms, and fire stations. Okay, so some of the criminal justice responses. So there is a huge conviction rate in cases pursued. So 94%, that's a very good conviction rate. However, cases are often not pursued. It's hard to get evidence. It's hard to, the child might not want to take part in it. They don't really know what happened. So these cases are not, tried as often, but when they are tried, they are convicted quite frequently. So cases are assigned a guardian ad litem. This is somebody that sort of vouches for the child. They are the one that has a child's best interest in mind as they're sort of navigating this court system. And they provide sort of protection and guidance for the child. So children get alternatives to traditional testimony. So this means that they don't have to necessarily face their accuser the accused in court. So they're able to testify over video instead. Some courts use a two-way mirror so that the child is not able to see the offender, but everyone else can sort of still see the child investigating. And child abuse registries. So these ensure people with child abuse convictions cannot work with children. So if you're convicted of child abuse, obviously you're not allowed to work in a school or daycare somewhere there would be children. Okay, so preventing child abuse. There has been, a sort of long-standing prevention program that actually has been quite effective at preventing child maltreatment. So this is called nurse-family partnerships. So they started in the 70s and they're still being used today. They're still popular today. And these programs target low-income first-time mothers during their pregnancy. So this is before the child is even born. A nurse starts visiting the home of the mother and starts teaching her about things like child nutrition, how to care for her child, how to change diapers, how to bond with her child properly. And they focus on the health. They'll give the mother, make sure she has proper nutrition. They'll give her some vitamin supplements. And the nurse will visit the mother, I think it's about once a month until the child is 2 years old, just to make sure, the developmental goals are being met, everyone's doing good, the child is in a good situation, and this helps mothers bond with their kids, provide these sort of crucial interactions with their child until they're 2 years old, and it has been very effective. So in some of the follow-up studies that have been done, it's found that these kids were had better grades overall. They're much less likely to be arrested in the teenage years and adulthood. They usually had higher incomes, less likely to live in poverty. So while the payoff takes a while to see whether it's going to be effective, the studies that have been done have found these nurse-family partnerships to be very effective in preventing child abuse. Okay, so next we're going to talk about elder maltreatment. So this is maltreatment of a person over the age of 60. So like child maltreatment, this was largely hidden. It was sort of something that happened behind closed doors. It was something that families dealt with on their own. You didn't go to the criminal justice system for elder maltreatment until about the 1970s when people started figuring out that this was going on. However, funding for research really lags behind that for child abuse. So there's a lot more funding for researchers to study child abuse than there is to study elder maltreatment. But it is a pervasive problem. So the World Health Organization found that in 2021, 1 in 6 people have experienced elder maltreatment. So this is something that is going to be something that does become more prevalent. We have an aging population right now, and in the next coming decades, it's going to only get older. So it's expected that it's going to increase the rates of elder abuse, which means we need to get some of this funding for research in order to, figure out how to prevent it. So elder maltreatment kind of takes over some of the same types as child maltreatment. This is physical, emotional or psychological, sexual abuse, and neglect. There is also one type of elder maltreatment that children are not subject to, and this is financial exploitation. So this is what a caregiver illegally or improperly uses an elder person's property or funds. So you'll hear about this a lot where Often the, adult children of the elder starts, taking a little bit off their bank accounts, or take some of their property. Often the elders might not know what's going on. So this is a very common type of elder maltreatment. Can include cashing checks without permission, stealing, coercing them to sign documents, forging signatures, power of attorney abuse. And this is not insignificant. So annual loss of victims is about $36 billion, according to the National Council of Aging. So it's something that happens a lot. So this is really difficult to determine exactly the extent of elder maltreatment due to a lack of reporting. So only 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse is reported, so even less likely than child abuse to be reported. Why not report? So maybe an older person knows that they're being maltreated, but they just don't want to throw their adult children under the bus. They could be dependent on the perpetrator, fear of retaliation from the perpetrator. Maybe they still live at home and, their adult children let them live in the house, but they're maltreating them, often, financial exploitation. They think, okay, well, they're taking my money, but I don't want to, move to a home, so I'm just not going to say anything about it. A lot of the time, they're not aware of the abuse. Older people often, have cognitive difficulties, maybe they have dementia, and they just, don't know what's going on. They may feel ashamed. They might, sort of have a fuzzy memory thinking, okay, did this happen? Did it not? I'm not sure. Maybe they are embarrassed about it. Lots of different reasons, and, very, very underreported. Okay, so how do we measure elder maltreatment? So we measure it by the National Elder Abuse Incident Study. And this is reports made to Adult Protective Services. So it's kind of like the CPS reports of child abuse. However, only 16% of victims reported their cases to APS. Again, very underreported, and only about half these were substantiated. So only about half of them had enough evidence to say, yeah, this actually happened. So family members were most likely to report abuse by others. So this is usually abuse by caretaker homes or nurses. Police departments are most likely to report physical abuse, and hospitals are most likely to report abandonment. So this is when the person that's supposed to be caring for the elder person, abandons them and just no longer cares for them. Okay, so females are actually at greater risk than males to be victims of maltreatment, specifically, physical, emotional. Abandonment is actually more common for males than it is for females. People might be more watchful over older women, so it might be that they're reporting it a little bit more. And women also have longer life expectancy. So older people are at greater risk. So those over the age of 80 are at the greatest risk, and women tend to live longer, so that might put them at higher risk. Those who are abused are more likely to live in a care home and more likely to have dementia. Okay, so elder maltreatment did increase for what we know, according to the World Health Organization, during the pandemic. Social isolation. So this is a big one. Until recently, people were not able to visit their older relatives in care homes because they didn't want to bring in COVID to these, vulnerable populations. So this social isolation led to much more opportunity to commit acts of elder abuse in care homes. Often these were acts of neglect, so not taking care of them properly. Maybe they're, not they're getting bed sores and these sorts of things. So this really increased during the pandemic. Abuse goes undetected. If, relatives were not able to come visit them, they could not see what was happening to their older relatives. So one study found that rates actually increased 84%. Doesn't mean it rates everywhere. This is just one study, but for the research that has been done so far, it, pretty likely that it did increase during COVID. Okay, so some of the responses to elder maltreatment. So the Older Americans Act of 1965 created the Long-Term Ombudsman's Program. So this really evaluated the abuse and neglect perpetrated by institutional caretakers. So this means that, care homes weren't these things that weren't ever looked at. They started going into them and making sure that, they were running how they were supposed to, and people were being taken care of how they're supposed to. So the Elder Justice Act of 2010 is going to give $400 million over 4 years to Adult Protective Services. So laws didn't necessarily change because there were already laws in place that prohibit or criminalize the majority of this abuse. But some laws specifically put elder maltreatment as a specific law as well. So criminal justice responses. So there is a growth in multi-agency response to elder maltreatment. So this is sort of the collaboration between care homes, hospitals, adult protective services, etc., in order to sort of, figure out what sorts of elder maltreatment is going on. There's now a database to detect those convicted of elder abuse. However, prevention programs to address this are really lacking. So hopefully there's, more funding in the coming years because this is expected to be a huge issue in the next couple decades as our population ages.